take action under the Constitution where there is an important national interest to protect for the United States without congressional authorization, but you provide a war powers report. If you remain in hostilities for 60 days, then essentially Congress has to authorize it, or you bring your forces.
I appreciate that. It's also important to note that President Obama, the Obama administration, their legal justification was under the AUMF.
美国
众议院听证会，听证美国白宫对伊朗的政策。I have a limited amount of time, but I'll be happy to talk to you offline or show you any products that were put out by the administration. With my limited time, I just want to say to the Iranian protesters who are out there right now, who want prosperity, stability, freedom, they want a better way of life. There are many here who are watching in the United States Congress, in the United States, wishing them the best, wanting a better future with vision and hopes for their nation. So for all those Iranian protesters who are out there right now in search of a better future, we're watching, we're praying, and wish it works out in the best for you and want to be supportive however is appropriate. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Espaillat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, witnesses, for being here. Mr. Chairman, I first want to express my disappointment that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is not here today to answer substantive questions that we have regarding this particular issue. He's here when he comes every year for budget issues, as I'm sure he will be coming around in a couple of months. And we have been very supportive of increasing the budget for the State Department. In fact, while facing dramatic cuts, we had a bipartisan effort to ensure that the State Department continues to be funded robustly. And so I'm disappointed that he's not here to answer any questions. But I want to say that although I was not here when the JCPOA was adopted, I recognize that, in fact, it wasn't a fully strong document, but it was a good beginning. It certainly didn't have anything regarding fighting or ensuring that Iran funds some bad actors in the world, or that it steps away from its interballistic missile program. But it was a start, and what I hear from the inspectors is that, in fact, they complied with most of the provisions of that, if not all of the provisions of that agreement. So my questions to you individually, and this is a yes or no answer question, is whether or not you feel or you gather enough information or evidence that from the inspectors or otherwise that you feel that Iran comply with the provisions established by the JCPOA. Mr. Haas, do you feel that they comply? Yes or no?
Based on everything I've read, the international inspectors made the case that Iran was in compliance.
Ms. Haynes?
Yes, same.
Mr. Hatley?
So far as I know, yes.
Okay, so do you feel that the region now, or our allies in the region, are safer now today than they were after the signing of the agreement? Mr. Haas?
Whether our allies are safer than they were?
The region and our allies in the region, yes. Israel, other allies that we have in the regions, and the region itself, is it safer now than it was after the signing of the agreement?
In terms of the nuclear threat from Iran?
In general, including the nuclear threat.
Well, in general, I would say the region has continued to deteriorate. So I think most of the countries and people of the Middle East are less safe than they were 5 years ago for a host of reasons.
Okay. Ms. Haynes?
Yeah, I have nothing to add.
Mr. Hatley?
They're less safe overwhelmingly because of Iran's destabilizing activities.
But do you think that the deterioration of the destabilization of Iran to some degree had some connection with this administration ripping up the agreement, the JCPOA?
No, I think as I think one of the members said, their destabilizing activities were ongoing before the JCPOA, and if anything, they stepped up after the JCPOA, long before President Trump decided to withdraw in 2018.
Let me just say that I also think that, in fact, it was a good start. I'm not arguing that things could have not gotten better, including that aspect of our discussion. but it was a great start. And to rip it up and sort of like go to ground zero and start again, and throwing our allies under the bus, we assembled one of the most impressive coalitions of foreign governments to fully back this agreement. And we walked out on them and we threw them under the bus. I don't think that we're going to be able to assemble them again for any significant operation there. Do you think that we can assemble them again, Mr. Haas?
I think so, and I hope so. I'm not nearly as pessimistic as you there. And again, today's reports suggest that the allies are not walking away from the need to work together to contend with the Iranian threat. Let me say 30 seconds very quickly, Congressman. I think it's possible to have doubts about the JCPOA, to see it in some way as flawed, at the same time to be critical of the administration for having exited it unilaterally. I think it's possible to manage both thoughts simultaneously.
Ms. Haynes?
Thank you. I think the one thing that I would like to add is on a rare moment of disagreement with Mr. Hadley, I really do believe that Iran's destabilizing activities increased measurably after President Trump withdrew from the agreement and began to exercise his maximum pressure campaign, and largely because there really wasn't that diplomatic off-ramp, and this was the way for Iran to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to conclude by saying that I'm cautiously optimistic. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Mast.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think there's been three fundamental questions that have been posed by many on both sides in the panel, and that was it wise, was it imminent, and was it a choice? And I want to talk about all those three things, maybe in a euphemism or a comparison. I look at Soleimani as a terrorist nest, as a terrorist machine gun nest, really. He's been spraying rounds at the U.S. for many years on many different fronts. So if I look at him like a terrorist machine gun nest, and I ask myself, number one, is it a choice to take that nest out? This is something I have very specific experience with on the theaters of war and our battlefields. Yeah, it's a choice to take that out all day long. But it's not really a choice when you consider that if you leave that there, walk around it, ignore it, that somebody else is going to come across that nest eventually, and they're going to get shot at. You want to ask, is it wise? Well, I think it probably always defies conventional wisdom to go out there and attack a machine gun nest. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have to be done. And then you want to ask, is it imminent? Well, just because this machine gun nest might be taking a moment to reload, that doesn't mean that it's not an imminent threat. It just got done firing rounds over at our embassy. Over the last number of years, it had been working to attack our service members time and time again. Just because it was taking a breather to reload, that didn't mean it wasn't an imminent threat, because it wasn't literally pushing the button on something. Now I want to ask a question. Some people might call this rhetorical, but I'm not going to ask it as rhetorical. There's a number of my colleagues still remaining here. I am more than willing to yield to any of my colleagues that want to answer this question. If you walk out this hallway and you take a right and another right and another right, you're going to come to several beautiful walls that have the names of our fallen service members from the War on Terror. And I would ask, can any of you provide me one name on that wall that doesn't justify killing Soleimani? I got 2 minutes and 30 seconds. I'll be more than happy to sit here and wait. Somebody provide me with a name on that wall that does not justify his killing.
Well, the gentleman may continue.
I'm continuing, Mr. Chairman. I got 2 minutes remaining. I will sit here and wait for somebody to provide me with a name on that wall that does not justify the killing of Soleimani.
Thank you, Mr. Mast. I think you've made your point. Mr. Phillips.
Mr. Chairman, I have not yielded back my time, and I still have a minute and 45 seconds
You're disrupting the procedures
I will not
right now.
yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
You're disrupting
I
the
have a
procedures,
minute and
Mr.
45
Mast.
seconds remaining, of which I would like to wait for somebody to provide me with a name of
think
somebody on our
you've made your
memorial wall
points.
who does
You're
not
out of order, Mr.
justify
Mass.
the killing of Soleimani.
You are out of
I
order.
will not yield
You
back
are out
my
of
time.
order, Mr. Mass.
I will
Mr.
not
Chair,
yield back
made
my
your
time.
point.
I am
Mr.
not
Chair,
out of order.
Mr.
You
Chair,
are out of
I'll
order,
yield a minute.
Mr. Chairman, for reclaiming this time.
Mr. Chair, I'll yield a minute of my time to Mr. Mast.
Oh, he's got time.
Thank you. Thank you, my colleague. I appreciate it.
Mr. Phillips doesn't have time. No, because he didn't have time.
Okay. Why did Phillips give him an extra minute? It was what? So is that the thing here?
Yeah, so Phillips has a right to say so he didn't have time.
Yeah.
It's Masses.
Okay.
He has a right to wait it out.
Okay.
And then you call Mr. Phillips once it's done.
众议院是轮流发言，如果规定时间还有剩下，那么他用他的时间，所以是轮流的。
Mr. Chair, if I might begin?
Yeah,
Thank you for yielding me your time. Although I did not yield my time back, I thank you. I will note that there was no response of one name offered that did not justify the killing of Soleimani.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Mast. I'm grateful that you took that time because you humanize an issue that all too often is not. And having just returned from the Arabian Gulf, visiting bases with many of my colleagues sitting in here right now, Mr. Zeldin, Mr. Fitzpatrick, Mr. Cicilline, I come to you and to this hearing with everybody with whom we met on those bases on my mind. I want to start by echoing my colleagues' disappointment in the fact that Secretary Pompeo chose not to come today. I say that not politically, but from a governance perspective. And I've appreciated today's debate and conversation. I think good arguments have been made on both sides, but I do not want to cover the same ground. I want to talk about something that I think we have to, and that is our authorizations, our AUMFs. We, of course, have two in effect right now, the 2001, 2002. And I want to ask each of you, if you believe, in light of the current circumstances in the Middle East and in the Gulf region, if it is time to craft a new AUMF, and if so, how should we do so? What should its components be, and how might we begin looking at that? Dr. Haas, if you might begin.
The honest answer is I haven't thought it completely through, but I am increasingly inclined in the direction of yes. That ones that simply deal with threats from terrorism or obviously Iraq are inadequate. And we've already discussed here today two scenarios involving Iran. One is the possibility that Iran breaks out significantly from the 2015 JCPOA, and we're faced with a consequential decision whether to undertake a classical preventive military strike. The other is to deal with situations where Iran continues to attack its neighbors or continues to attack U.S. individuals or forces through using whatever set of tools, and we decide it's important to retaliate. So, we don't need an AUMF, just to be clear, for situations where imminence is in play.
Of course.
That's the right of self-defense. So let's take that off the board. So the real question is whether we would need an AUMF, and I increasingly think yes, in terms, because of the nuclear situation. I think it sends some useful messages to Iran about our collective preparedness. I don't think war powers is adequate, because war powers gives the administration, war powers is the wrong approach for two reasons. One, it allows administrations to act unilaterally, and then it raises questions about our staying power. So I think war powers is counterproductive for both reasons. I do think, though, that it would be very smart that if an AUMF were passed, that it be effectively coupled or passed simultaneously with the introduction of a new diplomatic initiative.
Indeed.
And I think the two could very much go hand in hand. That is my tentative thinking, but I think you raised a big question.
Thank you,
and
sir.
a good one.
Ms. Haynes.
Thank you, Congressman. I do think this is a critical issue, and the sort of opportunity for Congress to get more involved in shaping what, in fact, the authority for the use of force abroad is critical in my view. I think, you know, as an initial matter, I think you should be replacing the 2001 AUMF that relates to counterterrorism. I think it is time for that to be updated and to be consistent with how Congress believes the administration, you know, and successive administrations should, in fact, prosecute that conflict. I think that the Iraq AUMF, the 2002 Iraq AUMF, should be repealed. That's something that we voiced our support for in the Obama administration, and the president then called for. I'm not aware of any military operations that have to rely on that AUMF. And I think this question of what should be the authorization to use military force against Iran, if at all, is one that, in many respects, it seemed to me that your concurrent resolution passed recently, the Slotkin resolution, is one that sort of lays out what you view to be the situation right now, and does so quite eloquently in the context of the current crisis, in a sense, with Iran. So I would support seeing that come to a vote, but taking further action on the existing AUMFs and expanding. Thank you, sir.
We've got about 15 seconds, Mr. Hadley.
There are new circumstances. There are new contingencies. If you could get agreement on AUMF, it would provide a firmer foundation for action if it was required. There's an awful lot of confusion here. This whole issue about imminent attack is not an issue about the president's constitutional authority, which is much broader than that. It really comes as a function of international law. I don't know why it is so front and center the way it is. And I would say the AUMF has to be in that process. Be careful that not only vindicating congressional authorities, but providing enough flexibility for the president to act. And to say the president could only act, for example, under the basis of an attack on America or an imminent attack is much too narrow and would, I think, be real folly.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your service. Thank you for being here today. Regarding the JCPOA, would you or would you not agree that for such an agreement to work, the signatories to that agreement, the members of that agreement, must be telling the truth and acting in good faith? Mr. Haas?
It sounds like the sort of, I must be missing something. Would that be different than any other international agreement?
I'm just saying, for this one in particular.
Well, I mean,
Do you believe that those two qualities must be present for an agreement
if I
to work?
may quote Mr. President Reagan, you trust but you verify. I assume countries go into international agreements for any number of reasons. In some cases, they may want to deceive. That's why there has to be adequate verification. I don't take anyone's word for it.
But do you believe that we should assume in entering such an agreement that the signatories are acting in good faith?
I would not assume that. That's why I believe verification and monitoring are essential.
Ms. Haynes?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Dr. Haas is reflecting, in many agreements, for example, in the context of arms control, and the JCPOA is no different, the fact is you don't trust the partner across the table from you, in a sense. You're trying to construct a regime that gives you the confidence, nevertheless, to take certain actions in order to manage a threat.
Mr. Hadley?
I have nothing to add.
Yeah. What I'm getting at here to the panel, do you believe that the Iranian regime tells the truth and acts in good faith?
With this agreement, they complied with it. I do not believe, however, in any way they gave up their long-term goal of preserving the option to develop a nuclear weapons capability.
Would that be a yes or a no, sir?
Well, Congressman, not every question lends itself to a yes or no. They were complying with the letter of the agreement. I do think Iran was preserving its nuclear weapons options.
I think the whole construct around the JCPOA is to avoid a situation in which you have to rely on simply a statement from the Iranian government that says we're complying. We actually created the verification and monitoring regime just to deal with that issue and to provide us with greater insight so that we could credibly judge for ourselves whether or not compliance was occurring and rely on additional third parties like the IEA to tell us.
I think because there was so little trust in the Iranian regime, that is why a lot of members of Congress and others thought that the JCPOA was not adequate because it did not push off or totally eliminate the option of Iran to have a nuclear weapon.
So with the isolated kinetic strikes that took out Osama bin Laden, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, Qasem Soleimani, did the panel support, and do you believe it was the right decision to make to conduct that raid on bin Laden, on Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, two leaders of ISIS?
I would argue yes.
Yes, I think these are very distinguishable circumstances. Thank you.
Yes.
And how are they distinguishable, Ms. Haynes?
Sure. So in the context of, for example, Osama bin Laden, the head of a terrorist organization that we were at war with and that we had, in fact, an authorization to use military force against, the United States took action. I don't think that was a surprise to anybody. I don't think that, it created a circumstance in which we were taking on a new war, for example, against a whole other nation state.
Do you believe Mr. Soleimani is the head of a terrorist organization?
I believe that Qasem Soleimani supported and engaged in terrorist action, and there's absolutely no question about that. And I don't have any, look, as I said in my testimony, as I've repeated, and I think as others have as well, I think he deserved his fate. I don't think that's the issue. I don't mourn the loss of Soleimani. I think the issue is that in every circumstance, when you're using the awesome military force of the United States and you're engaging in these issues, you have to do so as part of a strategy. And the question always occurs, is this the right target? Is this the right action to be taking in this context? And I think, as I've already identified, a whole series of consequences that I believe were actually undermined the overall objectives that both prior administration and this administration had.
Mr. Chairman, I have other questions, but I want to yield my remaining 30 seconds to my colleague, Mr. Zeldin.
I'll let you.
Yes, go.
I'll yield back to Mr. President.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Yield back? Okay, gentleman yields back. Ms. Omar.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to the panel. With running between committees, it's really hard to be here and to hear many of the questions and the testimony that you all gave. Sorry if this question had already been asked and if you'd all have given an input to this. But Dr. Has, I know that you've been somewhat critical of the JCPOA. Your perspective is that it's too short term. And so I'm wondering, what should a deal look like?
I think it's important to be clear about what a deal could realistically include and what it could not. I think it could include longer-term limits, ideally open-ended limits. I don't see why Iran should have the right to get close to developing a nuclear weapon in 50 years or 75 years. So I would prefer open-ended efforts, but if not that, many decades. I think it should include ballistic missiles. I think it should be verifiable. I think it has to involve sanctions relief. And I think, though, that other aspects of Iranian behavior in the region should be dealt with other ways. I don't think it's realistic to build a quote-unquote grand bargain that would resolve all of our concerns with Iran. In my experience, all-or-nothing diplomacy tends to yield nothing.
Yeah, I appreciate that answer. And so to you and maybe to the rest of the panel, I'm wondering, why would Iran, after we unilaterally left the JCPOA, assassinated Soleimani, destroyed their economy with our sanctions, threatened to bomb their cultural sites, why would they be willing to enter into a better deal with us at this moment?
The reason they might is, as you know, governing is about choices. The economic sanctions are having a significant toll. They could conceivably threaten the viability of the government and the revolution. So I would think that if Iran is offered significant sanctions relief, that might be something that they would countenance. They say they don't want nuclear weapons. They have, so it ought not to change that. So I think the question is if we can present them with a choice, I wouldn't rule out one other thing. I think we probably would need to have it voted on by the Congress. They would need to know that the next deal is not something that this or any president could unilaterally overturn. I would think they would want to have the confidence that it was truly embedded in the policy of the United States.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I guess from my perspective, you know, I continue to hope that there is an opportunity for negotiations and diplomacy, and I think we do need to invest in that, and I, you know, have indicated that that's one of my recommendations moving forward. I think it is very unlikely that we're going to see the Trump administration capable of bringing the Iranians to the table and negotiating a deal like that. I think that's a reality, and you know, unfortunate as that is. Thank you.
Mr. Bradley, did you have anything to add?
I'm a little more optimistic than my good friend Abrahams is, and I think Richard Haas said it very well, and I subscribe to his comments.
Well, I appreciate your insights, and it's, I think, quite fascinating to hear that you all think critical sanctions relief package would be on the table for Iran if it was to re-engage, more significant than that was part of the JCPOA. I'm sure that's excellent. And it seems as if there are opportunities to negotiate. So I hope that cooler heads prevail and that we deploy diplomacy and look at using many of the tools that we have in our toolbox. Because what is happening right now in the ways that things have escalated is not going to make us safer, and it's not going to alleviate the economic burdens that the civilians of Iran are facing at the moment. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mrs. Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, over here. 2 weeks ago, President Trump ended Qasem Soleimani's brutal reign of terror that killed and maimed countless Americans and coalition forces and threatened many, many more to come. I urge all Americans to unite behind the president's defensive decision to strike one of the world's most powerful terrorists who is organizing attacks against Americans in Iraq, in defiance, I might add, of UN Security Council Resolution 2231. He shouldn't have even been in Iraq, shouldn't have been in Beirut, shouldn't have been in Damascus. For far too long, Tehran has been permitted to act with impunity against U.S. allies' interests and its personnel. I applaud the president for making our red lines clear. Clear to the Iranian regime that attacking Americans is never acceptable, and when American lives hang in the balance, Iran will be held to account for its actions. The Middle East is a safer place when the United States is clear and consistent in its intentions. Mr. Hadley, to what degree are Iran's proxies dependent on Tehran for financial, material, and technical assistance, and how successful has the United States been in preventing Iran from providing significant support to these proxy groups?
I'm not privy to intelligence anymore and haven't been for a long time on these subjects. My understanding is that the economic pressure that Iran is now under has resulted in some diminishment of the resources that are available to these groups. I think, for example, Nasrallah, who's head of Hezbollah, has actually complained that he doesn't have enough resources for his activities. So I think it is having effect based on what I've read in public sources, but I don't have the kind of intelligence sources available to me that would allow me to give you a better answer to that question.
Well, I thank you. They've clearly gone through the $150 billion plus that were sent over by the Obama administration, strapped to pallets to be used for these proxies to kill people around the globe, including our American allies and assets. After the Iranian regime admitted that it shot down Ukrainian International Airlines Flight 752, tragically killing 176 passengers, and I know it's been discussed here at length, protests did erupt across the country. Mr. Hadley, how are these protests connected, do you think, to the pro-democracy, pro-economic reform demonstrations of the last few years? And do you think that this public outrage will constrain Iran's foreign policy? Can it be constrained?
It's been interesting to see how many demonstrations there have been in the last 2 years of people demanding accountability from their governments, ending of corruption, less sectarianism, governments that actually perform. You've seen it in Algeria, you've seen it in Sudan, you've seen it in Lebanon, you've seen it in Iraq, you've seen it in Iran, a lot of other places in the Middle East. This is a positive thing, and I think it is one of the sources of leverage on the Iranian regime that may make them willing to come to the table and negotiate an outcome, because they put down the demonstrations in October and November only by a fairly brutal use of force. And I think they are worried that the additional sanctions will kindle a return to those kinds of demonstrations that could threaten the regime, and is a threat to the regime, as Richard Haas said, that might bring them to the table.
I absolutely agree, and that's why I also share your bullishness on the opportunity that we have at this moment of time to bring Iran to the table for further negotiations, more now than ever. And these protests and the public outrage, I think, could really have an effect as we go forward in foreign policy and such. So there are reports that indicate that Iran has worked to reduce internet connectivity near universities, hotspots, limiting the impact of these protests. How vulnerable is the regime to information operations, and how should the U.S. be using information to target the regime's weaknesses and empower this change? Mr. Hadley?
Well, they have cut off the internet to keep demonstrators from organizing as a part of their suppression of public demonstrations, clearly. You know, our best information operation has always been truth, and trying to get it to the people in these closed societies, because what is really the toxic element for them is actually truth about what's happening in the world. And I think we have not done as good a job as we should in getting truth available to people in these totalitarian or authoritarian societies.
I agree. My time has expired. I shall yield back, but here is to truth and the Iranian people.
Thank you. Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon. I'd like to start with a question to you, Ms. Haynes. Recently, I had the honor over the Christmas week of traveling to the Middle East and meeting with our troops, some of the extraordinary service members who put their lives on the line for us. And I've been thinking about those men and women an awful lot over the last couple of weeks. Last week, the President said we must all work together toward making a deal with Iran that makes the world a safer and more peaceful place. But then just this past Sunday, he tweeted, "I couldn't care less if the Iranians, negotiate." We in Congress, unfortunately, have been given little to no information about the administration's intelligence that they allegedly had before this strike on Soleimani. So my question to you is, in your assessment, does the President and his administration have a clear strategy to actively reduce tensions between Iran and the United States and to prevent conflict?
I think I was as encouraged as you were by the idea that they are interested in negotiating something diplomatically. I have to say, I mean, I haven't seen anything that puts together a broader strategy that would actually be likely to result in the kind of negotiations that I could imagine, hopefully, happening in the future. But, I mean, honestly, I don't know that I would know. I certainly hope that they do have something, but I hope also that they will share it if they do, so that we can actually all participate in understanding it and pushing forward on it.
So I take it from your response that you have no greater information than we do here in Congress. And as a result, you wouldn't be able to answer my follow-up question of whether the United States national security is stronger now than it was a few weeks ago.
Yeah, I mean, I've made a case in my testimony that it's not, that I think that the action that was taken really further undermines the objectives that at least have been articulated by this administration and are actually quite consistent with the prior administration's objectives for the region. And I think, you know, it's unfortunate that we're in the place that we are, and obviously, you know, all of us need to come from here and try to make the best out of it that we possibly can. But I do think we're less safe in many respects as a consequence.
Dr. Haas, I'd like to ask you, and first I'd just like to state the obvious, I think, that while tensions between Iran and the United States revolve around many issues, none of these issues are more consequential than the possibility of Iran obtaining a nuclear weapon. I think we can all agree on that. In the aftermath of the strike on General Soleimani, Iran announced that it would no longer abide by the JCPOA restrictions on Iran's uranium enrichment activities, as well as restrictions on further research and development that could contribute to building a nuclear weapons program. And so my question to you is, with this as context, has the strike made it more or less likely, or neither, that Iran will ultimately be able to develop a nuclear weapon?
I'm not avoiding your question. I think the answer is it's too soon to know that. I think the U.S. decision to exit the JCPOA set in motion a chain of events which explains where we are. Because I can't answer your question, I would say two things. One is we ought to be communicating to Iran certain red lines that would be the limits to our tolerance of what they might do. And that would reflect our views, Israel's views, Arab views. We do not want Iran doing certain things. Secondly, I do think we ought to put forward, as we discussed before, an initiative that would improve upon the JCPOA and put it forward in terms that might be actually not totally unattractive, conceivably even attractive to the Iranian government, given the circumstances they find themselves in. I want to avoid a situation where we can't answer your question. And what we fear, and what could actually be, is that Iran begins to reduce the time that would be available for intelligence agencies to discern exactly how far they are away. If we ever reach that point where we simply don't know, or it starts getting close, what I would call the near nuclear option, one, we will have a big debate, as will Israel, about whether to undertake a preventive military strike. Two, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, and others will begin to have their version of National Security Council meetings about whether they need to follow suit and develop nuclear weapons options of their own. And as bad as the Middle East is right now, it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination to see how much worse that Middle East would be.
So you used the term red lines, and a few minutes ago, my colleague, Ms. Wagner, used that same term. And I just realized that I'm out of time. I apologize, Mr. Chairman, and I withdraw the question.
Thank you. Gentlewoman withdraws the question. Thank you. Mr. Watkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the panel for being here. Just a couple of comments. I want to express my full and complete support of our president. I think President Trump has done an outstanding job transitioning from a strategy of appeasement to one of credible deterrence. And I also want to express support and hope that we can muster solidarity behind the Iranian protesters. I spent many years working in Iraq and Afghanistan, and so from the perspective of both a military officer and or former military officer and a defense contractor, I think that perspective and voice might be worth hearing. When it comes to military operations, they need many things, but two things that they certainly need are speed and secrecy, or the ability to deliver in a clandestine nature. This body is incapable of both of those, of either of those things. And so when it comes to if it were a just kill, I understand the importance of striking fast and striking hard. And the justice of killing Soleimani is without question. If you were to ask me or a number of military personnel in Baghdad to strike a designated insurgent who's responsible for killing 600 of our brothers and sisters, and they were headed down Route Irish, we would grab our guns and we'd go kill them. And if that's wrong, we wouldn't want to be right. And it saddens me that we can't rally behind that. And over the mere fact that some of his compensation apparently came from the government of Iraq, I mean, think about that. That constitutes the fact that he was great as an employee of a country. Well, it's the world's leading sponsor of terrorism. So, listen, nobody wants war, particularly the American soldier, because he or she needs to fight in it. But I think I speak certainly for a lot of people that I knew when I say that the world is a safer place with one less insurgent in it. And for that matter, when it comes to safety and the very nature of credible deterrence, when we're conducting operations, you want other insurgents. You know that they can see you. You want them to know that should anything happen to you, if they want to take the risk of striking you, then a Reaper drone is going to rain hellfire down on them. And moreover, to those low-ranking foot soldier insurgents throughout the world, whatever country they're in, Syria or Lebanon or Al-Anbar, Iraq, wherever, you want them to second-guess when their choices, because if we could take out your general, we could sure as hell kill you. So I'd like to close on just reiterating my full and complete support of President Trump and his choice to go with a credible deterrence strategy, and that is in fact the strategy. I'd like to say that I've heard Soleimani being described as a martyr. Martyr is somebody willing to die at the hands of an oppressor for his or her beliefs, not a ruthless killer. I appreciate that, and again, I want to voice support for the Iranian protesters. God be with them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry, I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Zeldin.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Watkins. Ms. Haynes, we got rushed in our exchange there towards the end of my 5 minutes, and weren't able to do that important topic justice there at the end. So the Obama administration had airstrikes in Libya in 2011 as well as after 2011. The final decision making for that process for the strikes after 2011 were use of AUMF targeting ISIL. The final decision in the airstrikes in 2011 was under Article 2, correct?
So the initial use of force in Libya that I thought you were referencing was not done under an authorization to use military force. It was done under Article 2, as you indicated. There was a War Powers report that was provided to the Congress, and then there was essentially a discussion with the Congress on whether or not we continued to be in hostilities. And then there were, after the fall of Gaddafi and further action in the context of Libya, there was a shift, in a sense, of what the conflict was about and what the targets were, and effectively what we were trying, the threat we were trying to address. And some of it came under the 2001 AUMF, not just with respect to ISIL, but Al-Qaeda and associated forces.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we get on the same page. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Allred.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by expressing my disappointment that Secretary Pompeo is not here with the shifting rationales that the American people have been given for this strike, I think it's important that we have a public viewing and discussion about what went into this. And I think on this committee, we're going to have to be as aggressive as necessary to make sure that we're able to perform our oversight function. And I want to thank the members of the panel for being here today. I know you probably had other things planned. We appreciate you making time. I'm worried that this action has made us less safe, but I'm also worried about the reputational damage that it's done. For years, Democratic and Republican presidents have urged countries to avoid cultural and historical sites in wartime. It's against, of course, the laws of war, and it's also morally wrong. But just last week, of course, President Trump tweeted that the U.S. may strike Iranian cultural sites if Iran escalated the conflict further. Though, of course, the Department of Defense appeared to walk those comments back, Trump's remarks were widely publicized and, of course, widely criticized as well. To each of you on the panel, I just want to ask you, how do you think the people of the Middle East view those statements? How does that impact our reputation in the region? How does that undermine our ability to reach any further agreements to try and de-escalate? Dr. Haas, you want to begin?
As is implicit in your question, it obviously doesn't help. Like I think our reputation has taken a hit several ways here. One is the mention you had, sir, of culture, the possibility of targeting cultural sites, which would also be inconsistent with what many of your colleagues have mentioned about our desire to side with the Iranian people. Going after cultural sites is not going to help us in that undertaking. I think also we've hurt ourselves a little bit on not being able to publicly back up the claim of imminence, and that's clearly hurt us in Iraq, because it makes it much harder to justify what we did. And all this doesn't take place, shall we say, absent the context, and the entire post-2003 inability to demonstrate the WMD link to Saddam. So I think what we have done is created questions about our reputation, and I think that we will pay a price for that.
Thank you, Congressman, and particularly for bringing this issue up, because I think from my perspective, you know, I've found that I'm somebody who believes very strongly in international law. I spent most of my career working on international law, and I think it serves American interests in enormous ways. And to see the president tweet essentially what would be a war crime, you know, as something that we should do or could do or anything along those lines, to also talk about disproportionate strikes, which is also not consistent with the law of war. You know, to take a position like that is not just, I think, of concern to the region, but also deeply depressing, frankly, for the folks in the U.S. government who are frequently out, for example, our military, out training other militaries on what the law of war is and how it is that we should respect the law of war and the kinds of issues that we deal with. And, you know, in the context of particularly targeting cultural property, which is really, it's so much more than, you know, destroying, obviously, the bricks and mortar that you're destroying, but it's an attack on the identity, on the memory, on the dignity of a society. And, you know, this is something that we spearheaded a lot of the international law on, and we have a convention, the Hague Cultural Property Convention, that we're a party to. We're also party to one of the protocols. It's something that we've really celebrated in the United States in many respects as an issue that we should be promoting leadership on, and I found it very deeply depressing, frankly.
Thank you. Mr. Hadley?
I think it was a mistake. As you know, as you indicated, the Department of Defense began to walk it back. I think Secretary Pompeo said any strikes in Iran would be against legal targets, which of course would rule out the cultural sites. So I think it was a mistake, and I think I would not expect to see the United States attacking cultural sites.
Well, I think we sometimes fall into the bad habit of pretending that the words of the President of the United States don't matter, and that we can just have this debate as if those things weren't said, and as if we did not threaten a war crime in this region, in which we know how long some of these words can echo. I think the reason that the free world follows us and that despots and dictators fear us is because of our values, because of who we are and what the American flag and what our system of government and our values mean around the world. When we undermine that, I think we do much, much more than any insurgent attack could do to us, much more damage than any foreign country could do to us, because they cannot defeat us militarily. But we can undermine our own values abroad, and it deeply worries me, and I'm glad that we're having this discussion today.
Thank you. I want to acknowledge an old friend, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson-Lee, who was a member of this committee for many years in olden days when I served on it. So welcome back, Sheila. Good to see you. We have a vote, and what I could do is cut down everyone to 3 minutes to try to get in more people that we can. So let me start with Mr. Guest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Haas, in your written testimony, you do a great job of outlining some of the Iranian atrocities over the last 40 years, beginning with the 79 embassy takeover, the 83 bombing of the barracks in Beirut, the 96 Cobalt Tower bombings. You also set forth recent aggression, including attacks on shipping in the Persian Gulf, the downing of an American drone, the launching of missiles that hit the Saudi oil installations, the sponsoring of militias that attack bases in Iraq, the killing of an American contractor, and the recent assault on the American embassy. You go on further to say there is no doubt that Soleimani had the blood of Americans on his hand and was a force of instability in the region. And you actually state that Soleimani was, in fact, you say here, an evil person. And then you go on at the end of page 2 to talk about that the United States should have responded to recent Iranian attacks, such as the one carried out against Saudi oil fields with attacks on Iranian economic and military assets. What should the proper response should have been? It seems to me that you are stating here that the President's use of restraint actually emboldened Iranian aggression in the Middle East. And so what would the proper response and what response should we have taken, particularly militarily? It seems to me economically that we have imposed as many sanctions as we could possibly impose, and we could continue to impose sanctions from here till hell freezes over and have no additional benefit to those. So militarily, what response should the United States have taken after the Saudi oil fields were attacked?
Two things, sir. One is I think we should have found an equivalent Iranian economic installation, and I would have supported the idea of attacking that. Two, I think it sent a very bad message to the region that we would not respond to an attack on a close partner, not like Saudi Arabia. I don't want to get the sense. I don't ever want to communicate the sense that they are essentially adrift and they can't count on it. Thirdly, I think it raises questions for you all, and it gets back to the conversation we had previously about an AUMF that would provide a context for dealing with these kinds of acts of Iranian aggression.
And Ms. Haynes, do you agree that the United States should have attacked Iran militarily after their assault on the Saudi oil fields?
Yes, I think there should have been a response, and my view is very similar to what you've described of Dr. Haas's view, and as we've been saying here, that essentially by not responding in a way it can encourage some response, but the issue is again taking action to manage and to deter appropriately while trying to mitigate against the consequences that are additional to any action that you take. Does that make sense?
And so would both of y'all then say that the President's use of restraint or great use of restraint you feel emboldened Iran to continue to attack American interests in the Middle East?
Again, it's always hard to put yourself inside their heads, but my own take on it is yes, that they thought that they could act with a degree of impunity because they'd gotten away with shooting down a drone, attacking shipping, attacking the Saudis. I would expect there were people in Iran who basically say we can do certain things and the chances of an American physical response are modest.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Let me first say before Mr. Levin comes there, it's really interesting. It was just called to my attention that Secretary Pompeo doesn't have the time to come to this committee, but while we're holding this hearing, he did have time to go on Fox News.
Oh, my goodness.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Levin.
Thank you all for hanging in here with us. Last weekend, National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien said that 2002 Iraq War authorization gave the administration the authority to launch the strike that killed Qasem Soleimani. Here's the operative text of that authorization. The President is authorized to use the armed forces of the United States as he determines to be necessary and appropriate in order to, 1, defend the national security of the United States against the continuing threat posed by Iraq, and 2, enforce all relevant UN Security Council resolutions regarding Iraq. I think that language is pretty clear, and so did Defense Secretary Esper during his Senate confirmation last year. On July 16th, before the Senate Armed Services Committee, the Secretary told Senator Duckworth that the 2001 and 2002 authorizations to use military force did not allow the use of military force against Iran. And yet, here we are. Again, the 2002 Iraq War authorization allows the use of force to deal with the threat posed by Iraq, not a threat necessarily in Iraq or emanating from Iraq, but by Iraq. Ms. Haynes, do you agree that this does not authorize the use of force against Iran? The 2002 AUMF?
Yeah, I mean, to be simple, yes. I don't think it is authorized by the 2002 AUMF, and I did hear the prior statements by the administration to at least indicate that they also did not think that.
All right, let me further ask you, if Congress fails to make clear that the 2002 war authorization, or the 2001 for that matter, does not apply to Iran, aren't we setting a dangerous precedent? What's to stop this administration or any future administration from claiming that a war authorization for one country gives them the okay to use force against another?
Yeah, so there's classically, in my experience, the way that administrations would essentially look at an authorization to use military force, like, for example, the 2001 authorization to use military force, is that they would then consider if another actor, whether it be a terrorist organization, as it would be in that particular AUMF case, or in the context of an AUMF vis-a-vis another country, if that country entered into an alliance and was fighting against the United States, then there could be an extension of that authorization to another state in that circumstance. But I think, you know, obviously Congress has the ability to pass another joint resolution that says, in fact, that's not what we intended, and we do not, in fact, authorize.
I mean, my time's up because we're running short here, but I just think that it's clear that Congress needs to repeal the 2001 and 2002 and then do new authorizations for any situation that we think we should go to war on. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Spanberger.
Thank you so much to the witnesses. Ms. Haynes, it's so great to see you. I have been astounded listening to some of the testimony or the questions of my colleagues as we are talking through what should be a really foundational piece. What is Congress's role in the authorization of war? I've heard a lot of debate about what happened a week ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 16, 20, 25, et cetera, years ago. But what I want to move forward and talk about is the 2001 AUMF and the 2002 AUMF. And Ms. Haynes, I'll start with you specifically as a follow-up to the questions posed by Congressman Phillips and Congressman Levin. The 2002 AUMF, we'll start there, authorization for our war in Iraq. To your knowledge, to restate, are there currently any operations continuing under the 2002 AUMF?
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman. I can't say with certainty, right, what it is that the current administration is doing. What I can tell you is that in the Obama administration, we conducted a significant number of military operations that seem quite similar to what it is, frankly, that is currently being done by the Trump administration against terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda and associated forces, and obviously against ISIL. And we did not believe that the 2002 AUMF was necessary for us to do any of those operations, including the ones around ISIL, just to be utterly clear, including those in Iraq. And as a consequence, we supported the repeal of the 2002 AUMF, which we felt was outdated. And the President also had said that felt that it was time to replace the 2001 AUMF.
Thank you. And there seems to be some confusion among members of this body about how the killing of Osama bin Laden or al-Baghdadi were different from an authorization standpoint from the killing of Soleimani. I also think, and I'll take the opportunity to restate that those of us on this side of the aisle shed no tears for Soleimani, who I believe was a terrorist as he is classified by the U.S. government. But could you just walk us through specifically how the authorizations, what the authorizations were for the killing of Osama bin Laden and al-Baghdadi, and how that may or may not be the same or different?
Yeah, so for Osama bin Laden, the 2001 AUMF is quite clear in its authorization to use military force against al-Qaeda.
Authorization by Congress.
Authorization by Congress, absolutely. And in the case of al-Baghdadi, it's obviously under ISIL, and the theory of the Obama administration, which I assume is being used by the Trump administration, was in fact that because ISIL had a long-standing relationship with al-Qaeda and with Osama bin Laden, and a variety of other factors, including the fact that they had targeted the United States, that you could in fact authorize action against ISIL as well under the 2001 AUMF, despite the split in leadership between al-Qaeda and ISIL. In the case of al-Baghdadi, it's obviously under ISIL, and the theory of the Obama administration,
Thank you very much for coming, and I would also like to echo my concern that Secretary Pompeo is not here today. I do have two very specific questions. One reflects on Mr. Kinzinger's conversation about the responsibility that people in the military have to understand that they won't necessarily be safe. That's their job. But we also have a responsibility in Congress and with the administration to make sure that we are deploying them effectively and that we're keeping them as safe as possible by using the other resources and tools in the toolbox that we have, which is diplomacy and humanitarian efforts. And so my question to you directly is, what happens now that we've sent thousands of troops into the Middle East in terms of our efforts in Russia or against China and the concern of great powers?
I made the criticism the other day that I thought sending more troops to the Middle East right now lent, the phrase I used was strategic incoherence. This administration has articulated publicly the need for much greater emphasis on great powers, the challenge they pose, and its entire bias was to dial down the American emphasis on the greater Middle East. I thought they went too far in what they did in Syria. This is clearly inconsistent with it. So I would think it's, given the administration's own lights, it would make a good deal of sense to try to stabilize things. I think that does involve, as you suggested, a greater emphasis on diplomatic tools. In the short run, though, it may now be necessary to have those troops there because we have created, we have, if you will, poked a stick in the hornet's nest. But I'm hoping it is not this does not become the new normal, because the impact on readiness, the impact on what would be available elsewhere would be, I think, unfortunate.
And thank you. I'm sorry that I don't have time to ask the rest of you because I have one second question, which is that the UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which is set to expire now on October 18th, what, if anything, should we be doing to make sure that we are thinking about and address the expiration of that resolution? Those are it's the resolution that expresses the importance that Iran is prohibited from exporting or purchasing any arms. This is what President Trump is talking about when he says that everything is set to expire, and that's part of the reason why he exited the JCPOA.
Yeah, and your question is just...
Is there anything that we can do here in this body, given that the UN, that is set to expire?
Right. I mean, I think obviously you can support the administration and push them to essentially look for extensions of any restrictions that you think are appropriate.
And in what ways should our policy change if Iran was able to sell and acquire combat systems as a consequence of this? With my 4 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, as a preliminary matter, what you want to do is see what they do, and in fact, whether or not they can push out conventional arms more than they already do. We already have policy that actually tries to counter those issues as it is, and we would obviously want to increase, depending on whether or not they are increasing their exports of such conventional arms.
Thank you. I apologize.
Mr. Trone.
Dr. Haas, just quickly, prior to the assassination, we had real protests in the streets against the Iran, and they had a war for over 8 years. 100,000 Iraqis died. 100,000 Iranians died, and we were moving in a little bit of positive direction on the anti-Iran feeling in Iraq. Now that's all swung back. What do you think this recent events, this new trajectory, is going to do on Iraq's pro-reform movement and the protest movement?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think Iraqis have considerable nationalism. And the fact that because they're Shia and Iran is obviously Shia, that somehow there's not nationalism in Iraq, I don't think that's true. My guess is also Iran will overplay its hand. So I think it's probably wrong to underestimate Iraqi pushback against Iran. Again, it's also one of the reasons, I think we all agree here 100%, that it's so important for the United States to repair its relationship with Iraq, because I think that will give Iraqis a basis and some confidence for pushing back against Iran. I don't want Iran to have a free hand inside Iraq.
Okay, we got to run for votes.
Okay. I want to first ask very quickly unanimous consent that Ms. Sheila Jackson Lee be allowed to participate today, and we're giving her 1 minute.
Let me quickly say that I have not seen any depth of support by the American people for a war with Iran. I clearly believe it is important for us to explain that Article 1 does say that Congress declares war. It does give Article 2 powers of defending the nation. I do think the issue of imminent danger was and should be explained to the American people, and we should be truthful about it. So I have two questions. One, do we believe that any engagement with Iran prospectively and some resolution is at this point hopeless? I truly believe under President Obama, when we worked tirelessly for the non-nuclear agreement, that we had something that would allow us a moment to engage. And then anyone wants to comment on this completely upside-down explanation of imminent and the fact that there was no definitive definition or reasoning behind Secretary Pompeo's advice or the Secretary of Defense advice to the President of the United States.
Well, you've got 2 seconds according to this, but maybe we can give you 30 seconds.
I don't think it's hopeless. I think that it would do such things as no longer supporting regime change, making it clear that we're willing to talk. I think putting sanctions relief on the table, conditionally tied to Iranian behavior. I think that against the backdrop of sanctions, I think that there's a possibility, certainly worth pursuing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to have to adjourn. Because
thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your courtesy.
Thank you. I want to thank our 3 witnesses. I've been on this committee a long time, and I think all of you are just excellent, and I really do appreciate your coming here and speaking with us today, and we hope to have you back. Thank you. Committee's now adjourned.
Thank you, Chairman.
好，听证会已经结束，我们播送到此结束。OK。
And good morning. The articles of impeachment boil down to this president putting his own political gain over that of the interests of the American people. And what we see in the bills that are sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk is an extension of that. These are not talking points. They are policies that directly impact American families and could save American lives. Every day,